A dedicated nurse stumbles upon a secret list exposing wrongful convictions orchestrated by a powerful judge, but before she can reveal the truth, she's framed, arrested, and thrown behind bars with fabricated evidence. With the entire justice system working against her, can she fight back, or will she be silenced forever? If you believe that no one is above the law, hit like and subscribe to hear more stories of truth and justice. This is the story of Maya Thompson, a woman targeted simply because she knew too much. And it all began on a fateful night at Westbrook Memorial Hospital. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights filled the near-empty halls of Westbrook Memorial Hospital. It was late, well past midnight, but for Maya Thompson, the night never truly ended. She rolled her shoulders, exhaustion pressing heavy on her body as she finished updating patient charts. Another 12-hour shift, another night spent holding lives together while barely keeping her own from unraveling. The clock above the nurse's station ticked forward. Just as she reached for her coat, the sharp blare of sirens cut through the silence. Then, chaos. A gurney crashed through the ER doors, wheels squealing against the floor. Paramedics shouted vitals, their voices tight with urgency. 73-year-old male, severe trauma, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. Possible accident victim. Name's Charles Mitchell. Maya snapped into work mode, moving quickly beside the team as they rushed him into the trauma bay. But something felt off. His injuries were brutal, too brutal for a car accident. The bruises weren't just from impact, some were deep and deliberate. As the doctors worked to stabilize him, Mitchell's eyes flickered open. His breath was shallow, labored, and full of something beyond pain, fear. Then he reached for her. His frail, bloodied fingers gripped Maya's wrist with surprising strength. Her breath hitched. His touch was ice cold. "They're killing us." His voice was barely a whisper, rasping through cracked lips. "I kept it too long. Don't trust anyone. Protect it." Maya stared, heart pounding. Protect what? Before she could ask, his fingers trembled, reaching beneath his hospital gown. With the last ounce of his strength, he pressed something into her palm, a tiny USB drive. And then his body convulsed. The monitors screamed, "Flatline." The room erupted into action, voices calling for crash carts, for epinephrine, for one last chance. But Maya knew. She felt his grip go slack. His chest stilled. Charles Mitchell was gone. Maya sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the tiny USB drive in her palm. Just an ordinary piece of plastic, yet it felt heavier than anything she had ever held. "They're killing us." Mitchell's final words gnawed at her. She hesitated, then plugged the drive into her laptop. The screen flickered to life, a single folder. Hundreds of names, case files, arrest records, sentencing reports. And as she scrolled, her breath caught in her throat. Dozens of people serving life sentences without solid evidence. Warrants signed with forged signatures. Witnesses who had vanished before trial. Confessions that didn't match police transcripts. This wasn't just a mistake, this was intentional. Her hands shook as she kept scrolling until she saw the name at the very top. A name she knew all too well. Judge Richard Palmer. A man who had shaped Westbrook's justice system for over 2 decades. A man respected, feared, and untouchable. A man who had sentenced thousands, his rulings never questioned. And yet, his name was everywhere. Maya's pulse pounded. This wasn't just corruption. This was an empire built on stolen lives. Her hands hovered over her phone. She had to tell someone, anyone. But just as she unlocked the screen, headlights flashed through her window. A car sat idling outside, unmarked, tinted windows. A chill ran down her spine. She wasn't supposed to have this information. She wasn't supposed to know. And now, someone else knew that she did. Cue ominous music. The story has begun. The morning air carried a false sense of peace as Maya Thompson poured herself a cup of coffee. The rich aroma filled the kitchen, but the warmth did nothing to settle the unease curling in her chest. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Charles Mitchell's face, pale and terrified, his dying words echoing in her mind. "They're killing us." She hadn't told anyone. Not yet. She needed time to process, to figure out what she had stumbled into. But deep down she knew she didn't have time. The knock came suddenly, sharp and forceful, rattling the door. Before Maya could react, it burst open, the hinges groaning in protest as a flood of uniformed officers stormed inside. "Maya Thompson, hands where we can see them." A dozen voices shouted at once. boots pounded against the hardwood floor. Guns, far too many guns, were aimed at her like she was a wanted fugitive. Her coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the tile. "Wait, what's happening?" Her voice wavered as she raised her hands. A man stepped forward, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. The badge on his chest read Captain Morris. In his hands he held a folded document. When he spoke, his tone was cold, detached, absolute. "Maya Thompson, you are under arrest for medical fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the government." The words made no sense. They hung in the air like a foreign language. Fraud? Conspiracy? She blinked, shaking her head. "There has to be a mistake. I'm a nurse. I've never." Morris didn't react. "You have the right to remain silent." Before she could plead her case, 2 officers seized her, wrenching her arms behind her back. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Pain shot through her shoulders as they yanked her forward. The room spun. This couldn't be happening. She twisted against their grip. "Please, just call my lawyer." No one listened. By the time they dragged her outside, the flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars had painted her quiet neighborhood in chaos. Neighbors stood on their porches, whispering behind hands. Cameras flashed. Reporters shoved microphones toward her, their voices relentless, merciless. "Maya Thompson, do you deny the fraud allegations? How long have you been stealing from the healthcare system? Do you have anything to say for yourself?" The moment she heard the breaking news banner flashing on a screen nearby, nausea twisted in her stomach. Her face plastered across the TV, a headline scrolling beneath it. "Local nurse arrested in massive fraud scandal." The story had already been written, the verdict already decided. Hours later, Maya sat in a dimly lit holding cell, her back pressed against the cold cinder block wall. The metallic stench of sweat and bleach filled the air. The handcuffs were gone, but the invisible weight of them remained. She had tried to explain, to the arresting officers, to the intake clerk, even to the public defender they assigned her, an overworked man who barely glanced at her file before offering a plea deal. A deal for a crime she didn't commit. No one listened. No one cared. Palmer. The name burned in her mind like a brand. She had barely processed the evidence on that USB, but it was clear now. She had been holding something too dangerous, and in return, he had erased her life with a single phone call. A guard appeared outside the bars, keys jingling as he unlocked the door. "Thompson, let's go." Maya hesitated. "Go where?" The guard didn't answer. She followed him down a long, dim hallway, the air thick with the distant sounds of shouting inmates and buzzing fluorescent lights. He led her to a door at the far end and pushed it open, revealing a small windowless interrogation room. Inside, sitting at a metal table with perfect posture, was Judge Richard Palmer. Her breath caught. She had only ever seen him from a distance, behind the grand bench of a courtroom, his black robes a symbol of law and order. But now, without the robe, without the gavel, he looked like something else entirely. A man who knew he was untouchable. Slowly, he straightened his cuffs, smoothed the fabric of his suit, and looked up at her with a calm, patient smile. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he spoke. "You really thought you could fight me?" His voice was smooth, unbothered, as if they were discussing the weather. Maya swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." He let out a slow, almost amused breath. "Maya, please, let's not insult each other's intelligence." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "You're not the first to try," he continued, his voice soft but razor-sharp. "But you will be the last." She clenched her fists under the table. "I don't know what you think I have, but—" He cut her off with a tilt of his head, as if she were a child speaking nonsense. "I don't care what you think you know. I don't care what Mitchell gave you. It doesn't matter." The casual way he said it sent a chill through her veins. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, she saw something truly terrifying behind them. Certainty. Then, his smile faded. "Tomorrow," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "no one will even remember Maya Thompson." The moment Darius Thompson saw his sister's name on the news, everything else faded into the background. He had spent the past decade in Washington building a reputation as a relentless prosecutor at the Department of Justice, specializing in high-stakes corruption cases. His work was measured, calculated, every move planned 10 steps ahead. But none of that mattered now, because this wasn't just another case. This was Maya. At first, he believed in the system. He had to. It was the very foundation of his career. The charges against her were absurd, but mistakes happened. She'd get a fair trial. The truth would come out. But then he read the case file, and his blood ran cold. Every document he reviewed felt like a carefully constructed lie. The evidence was flimsy, manipulated, designed to frame, not convict. Key testimonies were missing, witness statements altered. It wasn't just a mistake, it was an execution. By the time he landed in Westbrook, it was already too late. The courtroom was packed when he arrived, the heavy air thick with whispers and the clicking of cameras. He pushed through the doors just as the judge delivered the verdict. Guilty on all counts. His stomach dropped. He had fought cases like this before, but never had he seen a conviction this fast. It was a show trial. The sentence had been written long before Maya ever stepped into that courtroom. Then came the final blow. Maya Thompson is hereby sentenced to 15 years in state prison. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few people gasped, but most sat still, as if they had expected this outcome from the start. Darius couldn't breathe. Maya stood frozen, her face drained of color. She searched the courtroom as if looking for someone, anyone, to wake her from this nightmare. Then her eyes met his, and for the first time in his life, Darius saw fear in his sister's face. Before he could move, the bailiff seized her, leading her away. Darius surged forward. Maya! She turned, but the doors slammed shut between them. The weight of it crashed over him. This wasn't a trial. This was an eradication, and Judge Richard Palmer had orchestrated every piece of it. The next morning, Darius pored over every document, every legal motion, every thread of evidence. But it was like staring into a void. There was nothing. Every appeal option was blocked. The files were sanitized, key pieces of evidence missing. Even Maya's public defender had vanished, his office mysteriously closed, his number disconnected. It was as if the entire judicial machine had closed ranks to erase her. A colleague from Washington called him late that night, voice hushed. Darius, listen to me. You don't understand what you're up against. Darius gripped the phone tighter. Then help me understand. The man hesitated before finally exhaling. Palmer isn't just a judge. He's part of something bigger. The people protecting him, they don't lose. And if you push too hard, you're going to find yourself in the same place as Maya. Darius's jaw tightened. I don't care. You should. But the man warned. Because if you keep digging, you won't just lose your career. You'll lose everything. The call went dead. Darius set the phone down, his hands trembling. They wanted him to walk away, to accept that Maya was gone. But that wasn't an option. Because this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about family. 2 nights later, he found himself parked in a dark alley near an abandoned diner, waiting. The door to the back entrance creaked open, and a small figure stepped out. Elijah, his 13-year-old nephew, moved cautiously, his backpack clutched tight to his chest. He glanced over his shoulder before darting toward the car. Darius opened the passenger door, and Elijah slid inside, his face pale and drawn. I can't stay long, the boy whispered, voice hoarse. They've been watching the house. Darius's gut twisted. Who? Elijah's hands clenched around the strap of his backpack. The police. I think they're waiting for me to mess up, to give them a reason to take me away. Darius inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. He placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. That's not going to happen. I promise you. Elijah swallowed hard, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a small silver USB drive. Darius frowned. What's that? Elijah hesitated, his fingers curling around the device. Mom gave it to me the night she was arrested. She told me to hide it. Darius took the USB, his pulse pounding. Maya had known. Even as they dragged her away, she knew they would come after the evidence first. He plugged the drive into his laptop, his heart hammering as a folder opened. And there it was, hundreds of names, cases with forged evidence, falsified convictions, innocent people who had been buried alive in the system. At the top of the list, Judge Richard Palmer. Darius stared at the screen, his breath coming slow and steady. They had tried to bury his sister, to erase her. But they had failed. Because now he had the truth. And he wasn't going to stop until the whole damn system burned. Darius Thompson had always believed in the law. It was the foundation of his career, the force that separated justice from chaos. But now, staring at the files on the USB drive, he realized the truth was far uglier than he had ever imagined. The system he had dedicated his life to wasn't just flawed, it was rigged. And Judge Richard Palmer? He was the architect of it all. Darius knew the moment he accessed those files that Palmer would find out. The judge had eyes everywhere. Courtrooms, law enforcement, the media. He had spent years building an empire that crushed anyone who dared to challenge it. And now, Darius was next. It started with whispers. Calls to major news outlets went nowhere. Every journalist he spoke to suddenly stopped returning messages. Some sounded nervous, others just hung up outright. A former colleague at the DOJ, someone he had trusted for years, sent him a single text. "Let it go, Darius, for your own good." He was being cut off. Then came the investigation. A knock at his office door. Two men in dark suits flashing government badges. "Mr. Thompson, we need to talk." The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years leading corruption cases. Now he was on the other side of the table. They questioned him about financial irregularities, procedural misconduct, even allegations of evidence tampering. None of it was real. It didn't have to be. The goal wasn't to prove guilt, it was to drown him in bureaucracy, to bury him the same way they buried Maya. He left that meeting with one undeniable fact pressing against his chest like a steel weight. Palmer wasn't just trying to discredit him, he was trying to erase him. Darius barely had time to process this before the real attack came. It was late, too late for visitors. The streets outside were silent, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Elijah had fallen asleep on the couch, the USB still clutched in his hands. Darius had just stepped away to check his emails when he heard it. The soft click of a lock being picked. His instincts took over. He grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, just as the door swung open and a dark figure slipped inside. Then another. And another. 3 of them. Armed. Not cops. Not government agents. Killers. Darius moved before they did, swinging the lamp at the closest intruder. The glass shattered against the man's skull, sending him stumbling backward. Gunfire erupted. The silencer made it sound like a dull thud, but the bullet ripped through the drywall, missing Darius by inches. "Elijah, run!" The boy jerked awake, eyes wide with terror. He hesitated for half a second too long. One of the men lunged toward him. Darius moved faster. He tackled the attacker hard, sending both of them crashing into the coffee table. Wood splintered beneath their weight. The second man raised his gun. Darius grabbed the barrel, yanking it away just as the shot went off. The bullet missed, but the sound shook the walls. Elijah scrambled toward the kitchen, fumbling for the back door. The third intruder turned toward him. Darius didn't think. He acted. He grabbed the shattered remains of the coffee table and swung it upward, knocking the gunman's arm aside. Then he drove his fist into the man's throat. The attacker collapsed, choking, but the first one, the one Darius had hit with the lamp, was already getting back up. Darius grabbed Elijah and ran. The back door. The alley. The car. They barely made it. The last thing Darius saw before speeding off into the night was one of the men standing in the doorway, pressing a bloody hand to his jaw, watching them go. Palmer wasn't just trying to silence him anymore. He wanted him dead. Maya knew the offer was coming before they even dragged her into the warden's office. Palmer sat behind the desk, calm, composed, a king in his throne room. "You have a choice," he said smoothly. "Take the plea deal, admit guilt, and I'll make sure you don't rot away in this place." Maya didn't flinch. "And if I refuse?" Palmer leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "Then you disappear. Not overnight, slowly, piece by piece." His tone was conversational, almost gentle. "Your meals will be late. Sometimes they won't come at all. Maybe you get moved to a new cell block, one where the guards don't watch the cameras too closely. Maybe one day there's a riot." He shrugged. "Accidents happen all the time in prison, Maya." She clenched her fists under the table. "You framed me." Her voice was steady. "You destroyed my life." Palmer smiled, as if indulging a child's tantrum. "I adjusted your life," he corrected. "And now, I'm giving you a chance to survive it." She let the silence stretch between them, let him think she was considering it. Then she leaned forward. "I'd rather die than help you bury the truth." His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Annoyance. For the first time she had cracked his mask. Palmer exhaled through his nose, slowly rising to his feet. "Suit yourself." Then he turned to the guards. Take her back. Let's see how she feels in a week." They grabbed her arms and pulled her toward the door. But before they could drag her out, Palmer called after her. "Oh, and Maya?" She stiffened. "I wouldn't get too comfortable. Your brother won't be around much longer." Darius parked the car behind an abandoned warehouse, his hands still shaking from the fight. Elijah was curled up in the passenger seat, breathing heavily, his arms wrapped around his chest. "We're going to be okay," Darius whispered, but the words felt hollow. He had spent his entire life playing by the rules, believing in the law. And now the law was hunting him. There was only one move left, one last card to play. He had to take this to the feds. But Palmer controlled judges, police, politicians. He had connections everywhere. Darius would have to go beyond the usual channels, straight to the top. His mind was already racing, assembling a plan. There were still people in the government who hadn't been bought, people with enough power to challenge Palmer's reign. But getting to them? That was another fight entirely. Because now, he wasn't just going up against one corrupt judge. He was going to war with an entire system. The United States federal courthouse was packed. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made people lean forward in their seats, waiting for the moment everything would come crashing down. Rows of reporters sat in the back, pens poised, cameras rolling, while legal observers whispered among themselves. Outside, the muffled sound of protesters chanting carried through the heavy wooden doors. At the prosecution's table, Darius Thompson sat still, his hands folded neatly before him. On the surface, he looked calm, his posture straight, his gaze steady. But beneath it all, his blood was humming with adrenaline. This was it. Everything had led to this moment. Across from him, Judge Richard Palmer sat at the defense table. His face was composed, but Darius could see the cracks, the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly against the table. Palmer had ruled over this town for years. Today, he was fighting for his life. The hearing began with the lead prosecutor laying out the case against Palmer, her voice clear and cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said. Judge Richard Palmer orchestrated a judicial corruption scheme that wrongfully imprisoned dozens, if not hundreds of people. He manipulated cases, silenced witnesses, and ensured that no one who opposed him could ever stand in his way. The key piece of evidence, a USB drive containing sealed records and manipulated case files, proves the extent of his crimes. Darius watched the jury carefully. He could see it. Their unease, the weight of what they were hearing, pressing down on them. They wanted to believe the system wasn't broken. But the truth was right in front of them. Then Palmer's attorney stood, and the attack began. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began smoothly, pacing before them. "This entire case hinges on one piece of evidence, a USB drive. A USB drive that, for all we know, could have been altered, manipulated, or entirely fabricated." Darius felt a flicker of unease. Then Palmer's attorney turned toward the judge. "With the court's permission, we would like to submit new evidence." A hushed murmur swept through the courtroom as a folder was passed to the bench. Inside was a forensic analysis report, allegedly proving that the USB had been tampered with. Darius stiffened. Palmer had forged a report, and not just any report, one that undermined their entire case. The judge furrowed his brow as he scanned the document. The jury shifted uneasily. Darius could see it happening, the doubt creeping in, the slow unraveling of everything they had built. If the jury believed this, everything would collapse. His mind raced for a counterattack, but there was nothing. Nothing they could use right now to refute it. Then, a voice broke through the silence. "That's a lie." The room froze. All eyes turned to the back of the courtroom. Elijah stood there, his hands balled into fists, his chest rising and falling quickly, but his eyes were steady. Darius felt his heart stop. "Elijah, sit down," the bailiff said, stepping forward. The boy didn't move. "No," Elijah said firmly. "I have something to show the court." The prosecutor glanced at Darius. He gave a single nod. "Approach," the judge said, his voice lined with curiosity. Elijah walked toward the witness stand, gripping his backpack tightly. He placed it on the table, unzipped it, and pulled out a tablet. "My mom knew something bad was going to happen," he said, voice shaking but never breaking. "So before she was arrested, she recorded something. Just in case." He tapped the screen, and a voice filled the courtroom. Palmer's voice. Cold. calculated. You think you can fight me? The system is mine, you're nothing, Maya. By tomorrow you'll be locked away and no one will remember you even existed. Then, Maya's voice. You're not untouchable, Palmer. The truth always comes out. Palmer went completely still at the defense table. The jury sat stone silent. The judge's expression darkened. Darius exhaled slowly, his pulse finally steadying. Palmer was done. The courtroom erupted. The lead prosecutor rose immediately. Your Honor, the government formally moves to issue an arrest warrant for Judge Richard Palmer on charges of corruption, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge nodded sharply. Motion granted. Gasps filled the room as the bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. Palmer stood slowly, his face flushed with rage. He turned toward Darius, his eyes burning. You think you've won? He hissed. Darius didn't move, didn't speak. Palmer lunged, but before he could take another step, the bailiff's handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The judge banged his gavel. Richard Palmer, you are under arrest. The case was over, but Darius wasn't paying attention anymore. Because across the room, through a separate exit, the guards were leading someone out. Maya. She stepped into the hallway, blinking against the afternoon sunlight, as if she couldn't quite believe she was free. Then she saw them. Elijah ran first. He threw himself into her arms, his sobs muffled against her shoulder. She clutched him tightly, her fingers threading through his hair, her entire body shaking. Then she looked up and met Darius's gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he took a step forward, and she was in his arms. She buried her face against his chest, her tears soaking into his shirt, his strong arms anchoring her to the moment. You did it, she whispered. He closed his eyes, pressing a hand against the back of her head. No, he murmured. We did. Outside, the crowd exploded in cheers as the news spread. Palmer was finished. Maya Thompson was free. And the system that had tried to break them was about to burn. The courtroom doors swung shut, sealing behind them the echoes of justice finally served. But outside, the world was still buzzing. News crews swarmed, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, capturing the moment that would soon be plastered across every headline in America. Palmer was finished. His empire of corruption had crumbled in front of the entire nation. But Darius knew this was far from over. Days turned into weeks. The trial of Palmer and his accomplices began, revealing layers of corruption that went deeper than anyone had imagined. Case after case was reopened, innocent people were freed, and for the first time in years, the people of Westbrook breathed easier. But for every Palmer who fell, Darius knew there were a dozen more just like him, hiding behind power, waiting for their turn to rule. He had spent his career believing in the system. But now, he understood. True justice didn't come from within a system built to protect itself. It had to be fought for. And so, Darius made a decision. He resigned from his position at the Department of Justice. His colleagues tried to stop him. You're walking away from everything you've built, they said. But he just shook his head. No, I'm building something better. With the settlement money from Maya's wrongful conviction, he founded the Thompson Initiative, a legal organization dedicated to exposing corruption, overturning wrongful convictions, and holding the powerful accountable. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly fighting for something. And he wasn't alone. Maya, too, found her purpose. She could have walked away from it all, moved somewhere far from Westbrook, tried to forget the nightmare she had lived through. But that wasn't who she was. Instead, she stayed. She began working with former inmates, helping them rebuild their lives after years of wrongful imprisonment. She fought for prison reform, using her own story as proof of how easily the system could destroy an innocent person. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a force of change. And then there was Elijah. He had seen too much, experienced too much loss, too much fear for someone so young. But instead of breaking him, it had forged something stronger inside him. He had made a decision, one that no one could talk him out of. I'm going to be a lawyer, he told Darius one evening, standing tall in his uncle's office. I want to make sure no other kid has to watch their mom be dragged away in handcuffs for something she didn't do. Darius looked at him, saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to fight. He nodded. I'll teach you everything I know. Elijah grinned. One evening, Months later, Darius stood on the steps of his new office, watching the sunset dip below the city's skyline. Maya joined him, arms crossed, the wind tugging at her hair. She sighed. "I thought it would feel like the end." Darius exhaled slowly, the weight of everything they had endured still pressing against his bones. "It's not the end," she looked at him. And for a moment, they just stood there, two warriors who had fought their way through darkness and come out the other side. Then he spoke the words that would define the rest of their lives. "We won a battle, Maya, but the war is just beginning." If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this remind us that justice isn't guaranteed, it's fought for. And if you want to hear more powerful stories about resilience, truth, and the fight for what's right, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support means everything. It helps us continue creating content that matters. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, stay strong, stay aware, and never stop seeking justice.